Good evening to you. So good to be able to spend a short while with you each week. Hopefully someday it will be back in person again. I hope you've had a good week. Weather has just really been beautiful, except for the little rain we had. But the last couple of days, it's just couldn't hardly beat it. Looking forward to church Sunday, and maybe we can get a chance to see some of your smiling faces. Well, I think they'll smile. I can't tell behind the masks, but can tell smiling eyes, I guess is the best way to put it. Okay, well, let's just not dilly dally around. Let's move on and talk more about Daniel. We're getting here. He's getting to teach us. He's teaching us a lot of good stuff that we can use in our own life. So let's just talk about him a little bit more. Now we're in chapter 5, and a little more than 20 years has passed since Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. Remember last time he gave a testimony of how wonderful Daniel's God was, and the decree for people to bow down and worship his God and his God only. And so there's about 20 years has gone by since he did that, and a lot has changed. A lot has changed. Babylon's not the same at all. Nebuchadnezzar's dead. He died. Daniel is he's about 80 years old, I guess, at this time. And instead of there's been a lot of what you call infighting within the kingdom, within the royal family, exactly. And the crown has changed head several times, and the changes have been really hard on Babylon. And in chapter 5, we're going to see the details of the last night of Babylon's existence, the last night of its existence, the last night of the empire's, the golden head. Remember the golden head on the statue that God showed Nebuchadnezzar in that dream? That gold head that stood for Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar's great kingdom. That gold head is just about, we're going to see it gone, and we're going to see the changes to take place. So there's a combined army of the Medes and the Persians has surrounded the city. Nebuchadnezzar's dead. Belshazzar, not Belteshazzar. Belshazzar remembers Daniel with the T. Belshazzar is the king, and the Medes and the Persians have surrounded the city, and they represent the empire of the silver. Remember the silver in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So that's what they represent. And before dawn of the empire, before dawn comes up, the empire of gold, that head of gold that represented Nebuchadnezzar and the kingdom of Babylon and now Belshazzar, that empire of gold is going to be gone, and the empire of silver is going to rule the world. Now Cyrus, we were talking about Cyrus. Cyrus was the commander of a combined army of the Medes and the Persians. Cyrus was a shrewd man, but he was compassionate. He was a compassionate leader, and he's going to come to be known as Cyrus the Great before it's over with. And after Cyrus captured Babylon, Darius, who was then the king of the Medes, became the king of the New World Empire. So Darius became the king of Babylon. And then Darius died 2 years later, and then Cyrus came back and replaced him on the throne. Now, the main character is now one of Nebuchadnezzar's grandsons, and this is the man named Belshazzar. Remember, I said not Belshazzar, but Belshazzar. They're sometimes hard to keep straight, but just think of him as the king, and Daniel as the Hebrew servant. Now, Belshazzar is now serving as a co-regent. He's He's not leading, serving alone. He's a co-regent with his father, Nabonidus. Now, Nabonidus had taken an army outside with the walls to engage the Medes and the Persians in battle. See, while Belshazzar, he was considered the king, he was sitting inside the palace and just not worried about anything because he knew he would be defended there. And his father, Nabonidus, took an army outside to engage the Medes and the Persians. He wasn't going to wait for them. He was going to go outside and get them. He knew he could go out there, and he knew that he could overtake them. However, he was wrong. He was defeated, and so he fled, leaving his army behind, and he went off into hiding somewhere. Now, a lot of major changes have taken place since the death of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, keep in mind that Nebuchadnezzar was Belshazzar's grandfather. The scriptures call him the father, but Daniel had written this book in Aramaic, and in the Aramaic there is no word for grandfather or grandson, so they just used the word that they used was for kin, and they translated it here father, but it should actually would be grandfather in English. Now, Belshazzar was the oldest son of Nabonidus. His father wanted to go to Arabia. Nabonidus wanted to go to Arabia. He didn't want to stick around there. And so he crowned Belshazzar as the king of Babylon. That's why he was the king. And then Nabonidus took a trip and left Belshazzar in charge. And Nabonidus didn't give up the crown. He didn't give up the crown. He was still a co-ruler with his son Belshazzar. It's just that he chose to place a crown on his son's head while he toured around and ruled the areas of the other kingdoms. Okay, so keeping that's kind of a little background as to where we are, and as we're starting into chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 1. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast for thousands of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of the thousands. Now, remember I said the place is surrounded by the Medes and the Persians. Their armies are out there, got the whole city surrounded. And they joined forces. The Medes and the Persians joined together to defeat Babylon. And Nabonidus had come out of the city to attack them, and he was defeated. He wasn't able to do it because it was such a great army. Cyrus now had the city of Babylon under siege. No one could go in or out. His combined army of the Medes and the Persians was just outside the city walls, and he was preparing the attack. He's wanted to take over. But Belshazzar didn't seem to care. I mean, it was undoubtedly had been told that he was secure behind the walls of Babylon. Belshazzar considered the city secure from any kind of assault because of these massive walls. Remember, we talked about those walls, how wide and thick they were. Chariots could pass on the top of them. They were so thick. So who could possibly break those walls and get through them? And not only that, but within the city there was 20 years worth of supplies stored up, food and supplies, 20 years worth, so they could stay in there under siege for 20 years and not have to give up the city. So the king had a little cause for concern. He didn't really care, and he even decided to show everyone how unafraid he was by throwing a party. He's going to throw a party. While the enemy troops were outside his beautiful city ready to overtake him, he was having a party. Okay, verse 2 talks about that. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father or grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine, and they praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. In other words, they weren't praising God, they were praising idols, drinking from the vessels that were sanctified. I mean, they were sanctified in the holy temple for use only for ministering to the high God. They took those vessels, and you got to realize those are, you couldn't hardly blaspheme God any worse than by doing that. They took these vessels and they filled them with their wine, and they used them to drink and praise their gods and their idols. See, not only did the man defy the enemy outside besieging the city, but the presence of the guests and all under the influence of wine, drinking from these holy vessels, he was blaspheming the God of heaven. He deliberately ordered the vessels brought out to be used in a drunken orgy to toast their heathen gods. Now, he had to know what they were for. He had to know where they came from, and that's why he used them that way. He was showing them that he knew God was greater than him. No God could do anything to him. But our God is greater, right? Okay. Chapter 5, verse 5. In the same hour, the fingers of a man, now this is, God's going to show him who's boss. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. What a change came over them. All of a sudden, they all got quiet. There was the hilarity, the joyous, the stuff that was going on, the jokes, the laughter, all that was going on, suddenly gave way to hushed fear. They were afraid. Near one of the lampstands, and this is probably one of the lampstands that came from the temple also, the lampstands that were used to light up the inside of the temple, and this was probably one of their lampstands because this is what they usually call them. But near the lampstand that illuminated this banquet hall, the fingers of a human hand were seen writing on the plastered wall. Now, this human hand was the same hand and the same finger that wrote on the tablets for Moses, the Ten Commandments. What a change. What a change. Verse 6. Then the king's countenance changed. Not only his behavior, but his countenance changed. And his thoughts troubled him. It's about time they did. So that the joints of his hips, this is how scared he was. The joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. In other words, he was scared. He was afraid. Just a few minutes earlier, he was defying God. He was demonstrating that he wasn't afraid of anything. Suddenly the fingers appeared, and they started writing. And suddenly the king was shaking in his shoes. he was scared. And I would have been too, I'm sure, if I'd have been there. Now this is the way it was. This is the way it was before the flood. People were eating and drinking and giving in marriage, and suddenly it started to rain. They weren't ready for it. They were outside the ark. Then when it's going to be that same way when Jesus comes back. People are going to be drinking and partying, and then suddenly he's going to appear, and they'll be unprepared for eternity if they don't know Jesus as their Savior. Verse 7. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers and the Chaldeans and the soothsayers, and the king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and it shall be the third ruler of the kingdom. Now, purple was a sign of royalty, a sign of wealth. Purple, the purple dye came from a little small creature, sea creature, and it could only excrete a couple of drops at a time. So it took a lot of them to be able to make dye in order to dye something purple. So purple was very expensive, and it showed that the person wearing it had money and had position. And so it was going to give him a purple robe, and then you're going to put a gold chain around her neck. Probably had a medallion on it that showed that he was somebody, the third in the kingdom. And the third in the kingdom because Nabonidus was first, and then who was out hiding somewhere, and then Belshazzar was the second, and whoever did this would be the third. So they'd be right under Belshazzar. Now the king's wise men, verse 8. Now the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known the king his interpretation. Well, it looks like these kings would learn pretty soon that these little rats couldn't do anything like that. So then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. Yeah. Now the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. Now this was probably not the queen. This was more the queen's mother. The reason I say that is because before this, in the earlier parts of this chapter, it says they were eating and drinking the wine out of the vessels, and it was his friends, his wives, and his concubines. So his wives were all in there with him. And the queen was outside. And also this queen knew about Daniel, so she was probably an older woman. So I would say she was probably Nebuchadnezzar's wife and the queen mother. So the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. She heard all the racket and the commotion going on, and she was wondering what was going on. So she came out to find out. And the queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. I got a solution for you, king. Verse 11. There's a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. Now, how would you like to be known as a person in your community who had the spirit of the holy God? People could see you and the people who were around you all could see that spirit of the holy God working in you. Wouldn't you like to be that way? You can be. We all can be. We can all have that Holy Spirit inside us. People should be able to see that spirit or realize that you have that spirit when they're around you. By the way you act, the way you talk, the way you work. The spirit of the Holy God was in him. And in the days of your father, reading on verse 11, in the days of your father, light and understanding. He had not only the spirit of the Holy God, but he could understand, and he had wisdom and understanding like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father or grandfather, your father the king, grandfather the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. So apparently he was not the chief of those. Now, since that time, since Nebuchadnezzar, he was probably maybe retired. You know, he's in his 80s, so he may have retired. But King Belshazzar didn't know who he was. Okay, his queen had to tell him about it. Verse 12. And as much as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas, which were things that are hard to understand, were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give you the interpretation. Verse 13. And Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Are you that Daniel who is the captives from Judah? Are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? See, he really didn't know him. He knew that Nebuchadnezzar brought him over, but he wasn't aware of him for some reason. So, like I say, he probably retired. They brought him in out of retirement. Verse 14, I have heard of you, and that the Spirit of God is in you. Again, I've heard of you, and the Spirit of God is in you. Not of a God, but the God. And the light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not give an interpretation of this thing. They couldn't do it. Can you? I've heard, verse 16, I've heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Well, he just heard about it from the queen. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler of the kingdom. He made him the same offer he did those little rats. Okay. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Well, you can just keep those gifts, King. I don't want them. I don't need them. God's work is not for sale. I don't do God's work for any retribution or for anything from I don't want paid for God's work. I don't want to be paid for God's work. So give them somebody else. I'll read the writing on the king to the king anyway, and make known to him the interpretation. So he said he would give him the interpretation. He would interpret it for him. Now, the next 5 verses in this chapter, through verse 24, is a 6-point sermon that'd make any preacher proud to be able to stand up and preach it. Daniel's text was chapter 4. His message was the sovereignty of God, and it was a toe stomper, short and right to the point. He didn't pull any punches. I mean, he told him like it was. And that's the way preachers ought to be. It's the way preachers ought to be. And here it is. O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. Now see, he gave your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, he gave him his kingdom. He gave the kingdom of Babylon to him. In verse 19, and because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him, because God gave him this kingdom, because God gave it to him, all the people trembled, all the people were scared of him, all the people respected him. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before them. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. And whomever he wished, he set up. And whomever he wished, he put down. Okay. So the kingdom was, God gave the kingdom to Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar ran it through God. But something happened. Verse 20. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened in pride, pride took over. God gave him this glorious kingdom that was best on earth, and he started getting proud of it. The pride took over. He wanted to take the credit for it, remember? But when his heart was lifted up and the spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from it. See, when all that happened, when he got proud of it and started saying it's my kingdom and look what I have done, they took it away from him and his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And then he was driven from the sons of men, taken away from people. His heart was made like a beast, became like an animal. And his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was out in a field with the wild donkeys, wild animals. They fed him with grass like oxen. He ate the grass, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules. Okay, once he got that into his mind, that the ruler was the Most High God, God Almighty, Yahweh, ruled in the kingdom of men, and it points over whomsoever he chooses. But he found that out, and when he did, he came back and was king again. But you, his son, or his grandson, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart. You haven't done what he did. He humbled his heart and became repentant for what he had done. But not you. You haven't done that at all. No. You haven't humbled your heart. Although you knew all of this. You knew all this. You knew the history. You knew what all happened to your grandson. But it didn't sink into you. Verse 23, and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. Oh, they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see nor hear or know, and the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Some sermon, right? Some sermon. Would you hate to be the one receiving that word? Yeah. And then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and his writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Paris, now it says Paris here because the up Paris means and, up means the up portion of it means and, so it's and Paris. So Paris, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Parsons. Now, many, the many here can mean mina, a unit of money, or it can mean numbered, and Daniel chose to translate it as numbered here, and it repeated it for emphasis. Your kingdom is numbered. Your kingdom is numbered. Said it twice, okay? God had numbered the days of Belshazzar's reign and of that great Babylonian empire, and its time is up, okay? Then the tekel, or shekel, tekel or shekel, whichever way you want, it can be pronounced either way, tekel or shekel, is a coin or a weight. They used to take the shekels and put it on one side of the scale and then put your product on the other side, and then your weight would be so many shekels, okay? So shekels means, or weighed, can mean it was weighed. So God had weighed Belshazzar's kingdom on this divine scale, and he'd found it wanting. It didn't measure up. In other words, it had not measured up to the standards of God's righteousness. And then a parson can mean half a mina. Half a mina. Mina, of course, like I said, was a coin. So a divided mina. Okay. So the kingdom of Babylon would be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Half of it goes to the Medes, half of it goes to the Persians. History confirms that very night, the great city of Babylon, under the co-regency of Nabonidus and Belshazzar, was in fact conquered by the Medes and the Persians. Now, how did that great fortress stand up? How did they do it? How did they get over those walls? Very simple. They didn't realize evidently the Babylonians didn't realize that they had this river, the Euphrates River, flowing through the city under the gates. Remember that map? If you look at your map, you'll see it. the Euphrates River flowing through the gates. I don't have mine right here with me right now, but it flowed through the gates, and all they had to do was dam up one of the tributaries, and it stopped it flowing. And when the water went down, they just marched the army underneath the walls into the city. Goodbye, goodbye, Belshazzar. That was it. So it seemed like so simple, but even the wise men, these little wise rats or wise guys, whatever you want to call them, even if they could have read what was on the wall, which they couldn't interpret it. They had no way of interpreting because they didn't have a point of reference. They didn't know what was numbered or weighed or divided, so they couldn't do it. It took Daniel, the smart, very wise Daniel, to do that. Okay. Verse 25, or verse 29, I mean. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be third ruler of the kingdom. And that didn't really mean much to him because the kingdom was going to be gone in just a short time, a few hours. And it says in verse 30, that very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. That was it, the end of him. Verse 31, Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So most likely, Darius was another name for Garuda, the governor, newly appointed by Cyrus to rule over and conquer Babylon, the Babylonian territories. The head of pure gold, that was in the dream that God gave Nebuchadnezzar, that head of pure gold, which meant the kingdom of Babylon, had been removed. It's gone. Remember? Crushed up and blown away like chaff. Now the chest and the arms of the Medes are the silver, that the Medes in the Persian Empire, and it began ruling that night. Okay. Now, chapter 6. Now, here in chapter 6, we come to one of the best known chapters in all of Daniel. In fact, the story of Daniel in the lion's den and the story of in chapter 3 about the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace are the two most popular children's stories in the entire Bible, I think. And many Christians, maybe some of you that have never really gotten into Daniel, many Christians have probably never heard of God's statue in the Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And we found in chapter 2. Or they've never heard of the 70 weeks of Daniel in chapter 9. But they are well aware of the courage and the faith of Daniel as he stood before the den of lions, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as they stood before the fiery furnace. And we can learn a great deal from these stories about God's sustaining grace. You might remember some of the days in children's church or Sunday school when you were small, if you attended, where you were sitting on a rug in the classroom, and the teacher had this what do you call a board, felt board, where she had the little figures on to cut out in paper, and they stuck them on there and told you the story of Daniel in the lion's den, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Oh, you had to remember those stories. So they're great. They're great stories. And we can learn a great deal from those stories, and I hope you did. But not much time had passed now since the handwriting on the wall. But there's a lot of dramatic changes that have taken place in Babylon since that time. The head of gold, that represented the first Gentile world kingdom that was on God's statue. It was gone. Poof, it's gone. The Medo-Persian, that second Gentile kingdom, the chest of the arms of silver are now in power. Belshazzar, the last and most foolhardy king of Babylon, is dead. Darius, the 62-year-old king of Medo-Persia, is on the throne. However, he's sick. He's not a well guy. And this is how we know that not much time has passed. As the historians tell us that Darius died about 2 years after he became the king of the empire. So it couldn't have been much time in there. And Daniel was still in his 80s, or around 80 years old. Okay, so let's go on to verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. Okay, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the kings would suffer no loss. So they had 120 kingdoms, and he had 120 satraps set over the kingdoms. And so then he divided those down into groups of 40 and put governors over them. And this is the first time that they've ever really had any kind of order in that area. And so he set up a chain of command that looks like it could work. It could do work very well. And this is another reason why we know that not much time has passed since the handwriting on the wall, because Darius is still in the process of setting up his government. So it hadn't been too long since he's overtaken that city, the kingdom, and now he's putting together his own government. So it's still pretty early up in time there. And it was the job of these administrators that he had appointed to protect the interests of the king. So they were probably told to watch these satraps for things like corruption, disloyalty, theft, poor administration. Sound familiar? Kind of like what we got today, right? Yeah. And so Daniel was set up there, and then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. See, it keeps talking about that Spirit of God in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. Going to put him in charge of everything. Kind of like old Joseph, remember? Verse 4. So the governors and the satraps, they didn't like it. They were jealous, just like we were before back with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. How dare him take this Jew that has been captured from the city and brought over here, and he always seems to find a good cushy job. How dare them put him in charge of us now? We need to find some way to get rid of him. This is what these little rats were saying. I keep calling them rats because that's what they remind me of. Little type of people. So in verse 5, these men said, "We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God." Now, so the governor, so it was Daniel's long life. He's lived a long time. In the 80s in these days was something. His long life and his career in government, he, not only is he an older man, but look at all the years he's served in government service. And it was without blemish. Not a blemish on his character, on his way of running things. And they couldn't find anything wrong with him in his conduct. In the past or present, or they couldn't bring any charge against him. So what better way of getting rid of him is the only way we can do it is through his beliefs, his religious beliefs. These men said, we cannot, verse 5, these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So these governors and satraps thronged before the king. In other words, a group of them came before the king. And they said to him, King Darius, live forever. Great salutation, right? All the governors of the kingdom and administrators and satraps The counselors and advisors have consulted together. Now that's a lie right there. They're lying to the king because they haven't all consulted together because Daniel didn't know anything about it and he was in charge. So they consulted together to establish a royal statute to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. So we have all gotten together, every one of us, except Daniel, of course, and we decided that what we want to do is pay a tribute to you, king. We're going to put up this big statue out there, and for 30 days, we're going to say anybody who bows down or who worships or prays to any god other than you, King Darius, because you're the king, you're the god, okay? Anyone that prays to anybody besides them, we're going to throw them in the lion's den. So, now, O king, verse 8, establish the decree and sign it in writing so that it cannot be changed according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. Now, the law of the Medes and the Persians was this. Any decree the king made and put his handwriting to, or signature to, it could never be changed because it could never be changed because the king was a god, considered a god, and anything the god did, it was a law, and if he signed it and he changed it later on, then that means he made a mistake. And being a god, he can't make mistakes. So therefore, once he signs it, that's law. He can't change it. And they knew that. See, that's why they say in verse 9, therefore King Darius signed the written decree. Now when Daniel, verse 10, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, see, Daniel didn't know anything about this until it was already signed. And when he knew that it was signed, it didn't make any difference to him. He went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open, didn't try to hide it, towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed, and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Now, these Jews who were taken into captivity and brought into other places could not have access to the temple. They couldn't go back to Jerusalem. They couldn't pray in the temple. So they were told that they could pray facing Jerusalem or facing the temple. And so they would get on their knees and they'd pray facing the temple. Didn't really matter whether the window was open or closed, but I think we wanted the window open because they could hear his prayers and they would know that he was praying, okay? So he did. He knelt down on his knees 3 times a day, and he prayed, and he gave thanks before his God, and this was his custom. Okay. Daniel asked God for help. He made a supplication before his God, and this meant that Daniel faithfully placed his matter in God's hands. Now, Daniel was facing a lion's den. He knew that. And so he just took the problem, went about it, go ahead and got on his knees, no matter what anyone else said, and he put it in God's hands. Now, what's that problem that's facing you today? That problem that you're having really trouble overcoming? That problem in your life that needs to be changed? Is it greater than a den of lions? It may seem to it, but I don't think it is. Daniel took this his problem, which was being thrown into the den of lions, and he put it in God's hands. Take that problem you've got, whatever it may be, and put it in God's hands. God will take care of it. God promises you he'll take care of it. He loves you so much that he wants to take care of things for you. He wants to do it for you. Hang on or I'll get to preaching. Okay. Verse 11. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. So they all went around and listened at the window. Oh, yeah, I hear him praying. Listen to that. Hear that? He's praying. Okay? And he was praying. He was putting it in God's hands. Verse 12. And they went before the king. They all, these little went before the king. And they spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? Now again, see, it's like the other group with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're reminding the king. They don't have to remind the king. He knows it. He signed it. He signed the petition. The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. I can't change it. I did. I signed it. I can't change it. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And they didn't say it, but he made it to making it to his own God. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself. See, he wasn't mad at Daniel. Wasn't even mad at the little rats. But he was displeased with himself because he was suckered into this thing. He was realizing now what was going on, and he got suckered into it. And he set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. He wants to figure out ways that he spent his time now trying to figure out some ways that he could deliver him without breaking this decree. And he labored till going down to the sun to deliver him. All day long he worked at it. But it didn't work. Couldn't find a way. He could not find a way. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it's the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree or statute which the king established may be changed. You can't change it, Steve. King can't change it, can't change it. So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king went out, as Daniel was going, he went with him, and he spoke to Daniel. And he said, but the king spoke and saying to Daniel, your God whom you serve continually, he'll deliver you. See, the king didn't necessarily worship Daniel's God, but he knew what Daniel's God was capable of. And he'd gotten suckered into this, and he knew the only way he couldn't get out of it, but Daniel's God could save him. Could save him. Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, and with the signets of the lords, and that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. Now the word in Aramaic for pit, or for den, means pit. So it's a pit down where the lions are. They're down inside a pit, and there's a entrance from one side of where they can throw out their food and stuff to them. And then up at the top, you can look in it and see it, but that you can also put a stone over the top of that to seal it. Now they did that. They put a stone over the top of it, put hot wax all around it, put their signet rings on it, because they wanted to make sure that nobody disturbed that rock. They wanted to make sure the king didn't go out there and try to save him, because the king loved Daniel. The king loved Daniel. He was the guy that had the king's back. He was the only one in the kingdom, really, that the king could trust. And he was so angry with himself and so displeased because he got caught up in this ruse for all these little animals were and got him into it. But now the king went to his palace, and he spent the night fasting. Now this is not the kind of fasting where you fast and pray. It just means he didn't eat. And no musicians were brought in, so he didn't have any music. A lot of us like to go to sleep with the radio playing music. Well, he didn't have that kind of music. Didn't have radio. Didn't have to bring the musicians in before him. Also, his sleep went from him. He didn't even sleep. He stayed awake all night. couldn't sleep. Excuse me, had to get comfortable. Verse 19, then the king arose very early in the morning. He got up early. He probably lay there all night long worried about Daniel. And he went in haste to the den of lions. Now he had an idea. In his mind, he had an idea that he could do this. Now, the king of Syria kept lions in captivity and released them from time to time for the hunting for hunting sports. So Darius probably kept his lions for the same reason. Some people seem to think that this was like the Crusaders, where they put the lions in the Colosseum and threw the Christians in with them. And that's not what this was. But it did serve as a deterrent for people who wanted to break the laws. Okay. But when he came to the den, verse 20, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions? What a question, right? What a question to ask. Then he got an answer. Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. Now Daniel used that term. Is my God sent his angel. And who do you think that angel was? The same one that was in the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He was Jesus Christ himself. He sent an angel and shut the lions' mouths, so that they would have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done nothing wrong before you. I have done nothing but good for you, and now you how I get treated. Now the king was exceedingly glad for him. He was happy. Boy, he got off the hook. And he commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den. No injury whatsoever was found on him, because he believed in his God. Not a scratch on him, because he believed in God. Verse 24, and the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel. Remember, they get their comeuppance, and they cast them into the den of lions. Them, their children, and their wives, and the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Now, some people have said, skeptics, people who are trying to disprove the Bible, say, oh, the lions weren't hungry, that's why they didn't eat Daniel. Well, if they weren't hungry, how come they chowed down on these people? They really did. They were hungry. And it was Jesus Christ who saved him from those lions. Verse 25, King Darius wrote, here's another decree, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. Make a decree, I make a decree, that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and he rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. First Peter 5:8 says, the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. That devil, that lion that's going around, will be quieted and stilled and made unpowerful. His power was taken away from him by the same one who closed the mouths on the lions in the den with Daniel, and who saved the children from the fiery furnace. That's Jesus Christ. God is able to deal with roaring lions. He has no problem with that. He defeated Satan when Jesus died on the cross. Satan was defeated. He's lost. I don't know why he keeps trying so hard, but maybe he hasn't read the last chapter. We have, okay? But God defeated the roaring lions in Babylon by giving him lockjaw. So that means the safest person to trust is him. The safest road to go is his. The safest way to be is saved by Jesus Christ. Oh, so good stories, good stories. Now, starting next time, we will be getting into the second half of the book, which is prophetic. We'll be talking about the prophecies of what was prophesied for the future. So I'm getting excited about next time. Hope you are too. And I hope you're reading up and getting ready, because we're going to have a great time. God bless you. Make his face to shine on you. Give you peace. Give you his love and your blessing, and just everything you ask of him, he will grant you. He loves you that much. And I love you too. And I'll be seeing you again next time. God bless you. Love you much.